thanks for joining us for a chat with Pav. We've got a very, very special guest today. It's not often that we have an international humanitarian lawyer, someone who has been in the British Army as a senior officer, a former war crimes and terrorist prosecutor, a hostage survivor, really keen to sort of find out more about that, a huge advocate for women leadership and cultural change, and a best-selling author. And as that picture shows in the background, probably maybe this might actually be your best achievement in life, is those three sons, those triplets in the background. Rabia Siddique, thank you very much for joining us for a chat with Pav.
Great to be with you, Pav.
Let's start there. Family. I always love to talk about family first. So three, well, maybe not so young anymore, boys. What are their names and ages, and what are they like doing?
Yeah, and you were right. My greatest achievement and probably biggest challenge, anyone that's a parent will tell you. So they're 13. So I now am the mother of three teenagers. I can't quite believe that. Who are all taller than me now. That's also quite scary. So their names are Aaron, Noah, and Oscar. And, you know, they're my sunshine. They're the center of my world. They're the three human beings that keep me grounded and really inspire me to keep doing better and being better. So never a dull moment.
So we've got three kids as well, but they're sort of 2 years apart. I can only, and that's a challenge. I can only imagine what three at once would be like. That's time for another story. But congratulations on that, and great to hear. I might take some notes about teenage kids for a couple of years' time for us. We're a few years off.
Sure.
Now you were born in Perth, but then you spent some time in India, a Muslim background, migrated back to Australia in 1976. Tell us about your upbringing and your earliest memories growing up.
Yeah, so mixed racial religious background. Dad is Indian Muslim, mum is Australian. They met by chance on a flight, got married. I came along about a year later. My dad actually flew with Air India, which is why we were based in India and why I spent my early years over there. But they arranged a short-term posting for me to be born here for a number of reasons. They knew that they would eventually want to come back and live in Australia and raise me in Australia. But also at the time, India was going through a lot of political unrest. So it wasn't great to be an Indian citizen back in those days. So yeah. I have little memories of my early life in India, but probably more vivid memories of my childhood coming here as a migrant family to Australia. As you said, in the mid-1970s is a time when white Australia policy was still very much alive. And I guess for me, the resounding memories that I have that really shaped me and my passions and values were the experiences that we had as a migrant family, and particularly seeing life through mum and dad's eyes. And I suppose especially dad. Muslim, Indian, brown skin, spoke with an accent, and the ignorance, the prejudice, the bias, the discrimination that he suffered almost every day and handled with a lot of grace and dignity, but it was clear that wounds were inflicted that would run a lifetime. And I think for me, witnessing that and having such a strong sense as a little girl of how unfair that was, of how unfair it was that people could be so quick to judge others based on the colour of their skin, their religion, their skin, their accent, really had a profound impact on me. And, you know, I wasn't immune to that either. I came to Australia with an accent. I had this unusual name people couldn't pronounce. Muslim, people didn't know a lot about Muslims back then. And I very much felt like I was a square peg in a round hole for a long time. And of course, that was then exacerbated by some life-altering things that happened to me later on.
I can somewhat empathise having an ICH, an itch on the end of my name, growing up in Adelaide. I mean, I'm a combination of Scottish and Irish, believe it or not, and Croatian, but I certainly felt some level of not discrimination or maybe some prejudice, I think, growing up, or just that unconscious bias was always sort of relatively present in my life. So a small amount, I can certainly understand what it must have been like. And so did that kind of shape your, or obviously it shaped your life, but did it shape your decisions around going to uni? UWA graduate, you and I share that together, which is a nice thing that I can share with you. I don't share too much else in terms of what you've been able to do in your life, but did that, that kind of background take you through that path to become a lawyer?
Yeah, well, we both followed our passions, so we share that as well, right?
Okay.
Yeah, I think undoubtedly, and I think the other thing for me that was formative and really influential in my decision to then go and study law and psychology was being a child sexual abuse survivor as well. At a time when child sexual abuse was filled with shame and stigma, and as survivors, we didn't have a voice and no one believed us. And so this overwhelming sense of feeling incredibly powerless and voiceless and harboring that secret and feeling so alone in your suffering and growing up with this already well progressed sense of injustice and unfairness, I think that absolutely is what drove me to study particularly law and want to practice in the area of human rights and humanitarian law. Absolutely.
So significant impacts in your life, and then you make a decision to head abroad to the UK in 1998. What was behind that decision?
I was really fortunate to have some wonderful training here in Perth first. So I worked for a number of years for legal aid and then the Commonwealth DPP, got a lot of court experience and exposure to a number of areas of law, and worked with some incredible communities and people, victims of abuse and family violence, our Indigenous and remote communities, asylum seekers, refugees. So it was incredible training ground. But I knew I had this calling, and there was this voice inside my head that was getting louder and louder that I couldn't ignore anymore. And that was this calling to practice in the area of international humanitarian law. And I knew at the time that there was very limited opportunities to do that and to serve the people and advocate for the people I desperately wanted to in this country. And so I made a decision in the late 90s to leave Australia, to travel over to the UK in hope of being able to realise this career dream, I guess.
And was that also behind, I guess, the career shift to legal officer in the British Army? Was that also an important kind of step in that?
That came later. That decision came a few years later. So for a few years, I was in the UK working full-time in a law firm to pay the bills. I was studying as a postgraduate, and I was also volunteering at 2 human rights agencies. But after a couple of years, I was getting frustrated because I was nowhere near the work that I wanted to do, which was frontline work, helping, advocating for real victims. And that was the driver, I think, around the slightly unusual deviation of joining the British Army. And really the British Army and the decision to commission as an officer in the Army was a means to an end. It was an institution that I, after much research, realised would allow me to access the people that I needed to serve and advocate for. So really it was never... The driver for me wasn't so much the armed forces. That was never really something that had been on my radar growing up. It was the opportunity that the institution would allow me and provide for me to do the work I believe I was meant to do. And
so you're in that role in 2001, September, when the terrorist attack happens in New York. What were your emotions and feelings at that point? Yeah, well, the army that I applied to join very quickly then became a very different army. I actually commissioned as a captain the week of the 9/11 terror attacks. And I remember actually on the day I was at Heathrow Airport. I was just about to catch a train back to Australia, back to Perth, my hometown, where I would only have 3 days here to spend with my family before going back and going on my first deployment. And I remember looking up at a little TV screen in the airport and seeing the terror attacks. And I remember getting to this little TV screen that normally had flight info on it, that had been switched to the CNN News. And I got there just in time to see the second tower fall. And I had this incredible sick feeling in the pit of my stomach that this was about to change the world in ways that I just couldn't foresee at the time.
And of course, that's what would happen for the whole world. And what I didn't realize is that it would also change my world in ways that I couldn't have predicted. So I returned, and then my career took quite a dramatic turn and escalation. I spent time in Northern Ireland, in Germany, training for what would be my eventual and most pivotal role as a humanitarian lawyer in Iraq and in the Middle East.
And did you know at that time, or did you feel I mean, if you take away your passion and what you were really, I guess, educated to do, could you separate your own individual feelings about being a Muslim and maybe what that meant as well? Or what tell us about the connection that you had actually to that?
That's a really good question. I think there was a number of things that were going on and unfolding for me personally and professionally. I think, first of all, as an international lawyer, there was a significant level of discomfort in terms of the legal justification for us in the West invading Iraq in the first place. You know, this wasn't Afghanistan. This wasn't about intelligence based or strong intelligence based military intervention to seize and capture terrorists. This was a very different situation. So there was this, I guess, professional and academic discomfort around why we were doing and the justification for what we were doing in the West. The personal conflict came later as Islamophobia grew and as Muslims as a community were demonized and victimized and misunderstood. That came later, for sure.
And so how did you deal with that, the later part?
I focused on my job. That was the most important thing to me. And my job was to be the voice for those that had suffered the most abhorrent human rights abuses, and for those that didn't have a voice, and for those for whom equality and justice were foreign concepts that they'd never experienced. So it was very easy and intuitive for me to put myself and my personal views to one side, because my job is what I was there for, and I had to remain focused on that. An incredible responsibility and an incredible privilege that I had to be worthy of.
I think that kind of is a nice way to think about it, because we all can think about our personal self and for selfish reasons, but I guess you had this great opportunity and vehicle and education and background and personal journey to be able to use those two together to really, make some great change. And I know you talk about that. One of your great quotes is that be the change you wish to see in the world. Do you maybe want to talk about where that originates and why it's so important to you?
Well, of course, it's the very famous quote of Mahatma Gandhi, who's been my lifelong hero. And that was one of his mantras and calls to action for everyone. And I guess it's what I've tried to live my life by. And now being a parent, it's something that I reinforce to myself and my kids every day. It's not for us to wait for our leaders, for our elected leaders, to solve all the ills of the world and to do the things that we're waiting for them to do. As we're increasingly seeing, we can't rely on that. Each one of us has a sphere of influence. Each one of us has a voice, and we can all live a life bigger and beyond ourselves to impact positive change through the stories that we share, through the way that we behave towards others, through making choices to call out and challenge language, behavior, cultures, attitudes that aren't serving any of us well, and that are keeping those that are marginalized from continuing to be voiceless. So yeah, it's been my life's mantra, and I think for me it's been my compass and has been the driving force around all the work that I've done in all its many forms.
Well said. Now, you talked about Iraq before, and you obviously deployed there. Just how difficult was it for you personally when you were a part of that involvement of assisting two special forces soldiers out of that, but then not being recognised? How challenging was that?
Yeah, look, it was a very unexpected situation where, all things being equal, I shouldn't have been involved in that. I wasn't a trained hostage negotiator. This wasn't my area of comfort or expertise. But when negotiations broke down, the Iraqi representative that was responsible for holding and for the lives of our two colleagues, two British Special Forces soldiers, he called for me. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that in the preceding several months, I had gained the trust and the respect of a lot of my Iraqi colleagues just by being authentic and respectful and honest, I guess. And so I was called in, and there was no choice. Despite my lack of experience and training, it was made clear to us that unless I was willing to step up and to step outside of my comfort zone, it could quite possibly have meant the death of our two colleagues and mates. So it was unexpected. It was scary. I was terrified. But again, I had to put myself and my feelings to one side because I had a job to do, a very different job that I never thought I would be doing, but it was to negotiate for the release of two colleagues. And I did that to the best of my ability. And I ended up leading a group of 6 of us. 5 of the others were male colleagues. And miraculously, we ended up all surviving the day. We almost all lost our lives in different situations on the day. And we were all held hostage for several hours, but we were miraculously rescued. I'm proud of what I did and how I stepped up. I'll never forget the support I got, particularly from the Special Forces soldiers on the day. But I guess for me, what should have been the end of the scariest, perhaps most traumatic incident of my life became the start of the biggest battle. And that would be the battle around how I was treated and how the military and the British government then responded to my involvement in the situation, and how they basically wrote me out and issued me with a gag order, never to speak of the role that I had played, the leading role that I had played on that day to save 2 men. 2 decorated soldiers. And up until that point, I can honestly say to you that I had never paid attention or focused on my gender or my religion or my race. I always saw myself as a lawyer, as an officer, as a human rights advocate. So to suddenly be forced into a situation where I personally was suffering from injustice and discrimination. It was really confronting, but I also had a very strong sense by then of my values, of my responsibility as a leader, and the fact that I couldn't let this go, and that this was a wrong that had to be addressed. And then, you know, the rest of the story is known to a lot of people, and I address in my book. And what ended up happening was a 2-year battle where I would exhaust every internal avenue of redress until the only avenue left open for me was to sue the British government and armed forces and to mount a discrimination case.
And that was successful in the end?
It was, at great personal cost. Anyone will tell you, any survivor of abuse or discrimination or harassment or bullying or violence will tell you that sharing one's story and speaking up and raising your voice in a very public way in order to impact positive change so that others don't have to is important, but it's traumatic. And it's a process that re-traumatizes you, if that makes sense. But it's one that I don't regret, because from that, so much change came. You know, it opened up the floodgates for many similar cases, and it led to profound changes in policy, in legislation, and importantly, in culture and attitudes, not just in the armed forces, but in the British public sector. So it just goes to show that one person, you know, can create a ripple of change.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I've got lots of questions on the back of that. Almost a lot of it you may not be able to answer. It's more the questions for the people that were in charge at that point. Why? Why didn't it happen? And obviously it's been proven that their actions afterwards, in terms of ordering the gag and all those things, were completely incorrect, correct, and wrong. And I'm glad to hear that you and others are fighting the fight on this front. But the question I would really like to know is, did any of that stage through the hostage setup or that encounter, negotiating your way out of it, getting the gag order, and then the 2 years of fighting the case, did you think about the discrimination that your father had and that others that and that you work for have, and did that keep you going?
I think a number of things kept me going. Recalling what my dad and my mum had been through, recalling what I had been through as a voiceless, powerless little girl, recalling the horrors of all the incredible victims that I had advocated for and represented, and this fundamental, deep within me belief that I couldn't go on in my work unless I was willing to speak up. That if I wasn't willing to hold people account for what was happening to me, and by its very nature, clearly many others that didn't have the sort of privilege that I had, then I would be a big fat hypocrite, and that everything I stood for and all my work and all my values would amount to nothing. So when it got hard, and it did get hard at times, my family was impacted. We had tabloid journos camped outside our house. I was followed everywhere. My neighbours were harassed. I was defamed and slurred in all the press at the time. It was horrible. It was really horrible. And it was lonely because, unlike today, there wasn't as much support. There was a lot of fear around that. So I became the problem child, and I had very little official support from my workplace, from colleagues, and from people that I had previously called friends. So when it got hard, and there were times where I thought, why am I doing this? And it's just all too painful, I called on all of those memories, all of those people that had come before me, and it reminded me of not only who I was and what I believed, but what I stood for and what I was able to do. And I remember I just kept saying to myself, with this privilege comes great responsibility. So be worthy of it, which are the values that I was raised with as well.
Well, congratulations, because that fight and determination, that steely resolve, I think is quite evident for everyone to see. And yeah, incredible work, but great resilience by the sounds as well. And you can see that's not only through all the experiences and encounters you've had in your life, but it certainly played out in that couple of years. I know you talk about female empowerment and women in leadership, and particularly with International Women's Day coming up. And of course, you can book Rabia on Pickstar Marketplace for any International Women's Day and Harmony Day opportunities coming up. So please look out for that. But you're a key figurehead in this area. What are some of the traits or things that corporates and business leaders should be looking out for?
So I think my story and the stories of many people in our country that speak in this space shine a light on a very important point, and it's this: it shouldn't take a crisis, it shouldn't take suffering, it shouldn't take an injustice for change to occur. And I think now there is this national reckoning, thanks to incredibly brave people like Brittany Higgins and Grace Tame, and the Me Too movement and the Let Her Speak movement. There is this momentum now that recognises that workplaces, that corporates, that government, that parliament, that every corner of our country needs to take equity, safety seriously, really seriously. And it shouldn't take a crisis. When we talk about women in leadership, when we talk about feminine power, you know, in our culture, we're pigeonholed as women. We're either the angry, fierce woman who lives and leads and plays the game like a man, or, you know, with traditional masculine qualities of strength as we associate them. Or we're the quiet, passive, compliant woman who works away in the background. We are neither one or the other. We're both. Yeah. We're multifaceted, and we need to have more sophisticated conversations. And I think in terms of key change, when we talk about this year's International Women's Day theme of breaking the bias, key changes that all workplaces can commit to are from grassroots up. So we've talked a lot in our country about setting the tone from the top down, and how leadership need to role model true commitment to diversity and inclusion and equity. But I think we haven't had a full conversation around grassroots, and really that starts at education and in schools, and ensuring that girls and boys, young men and young women all have equal opportunity to the incredible local, national and global opportunities that are out there in various industries. You know, engineering, aviation, maritime are woefully underrepresented by women, and yet there are some incredible opportunities that girls and women could fill. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is around structural barriers. So some workplaces and industries are doing well at recruiting equal numbers of women and men, but it's the retention that's the issue. And it's this whole discussion around having diverse people, not just gender, but broadly diverse people in positions of influence and decision making. And I think ultimately that comes down to a lot of our structural as well as cultural barriers that need to be addressed and overcome too. So there's some of the things that I believe in that are part of the work that I'm doing as a consultant, as a speaker. And that's what I'll be focusing on when I go around and have the pleasure and the privilege of speaking to leaders and employers and communities this International Women's Day.
I mean, you speak a lot of sense to me, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it follows through to action for even myself and the things that I do, but for others. I think that's the bit that is the important part, right? You know, whether you're talking about from top down or bottom up, grassroots, it's the action that gets the cut through, right? And people having
absolutely
the courage to act upon things rather than, as you're saying, waiting for a crisis. So could not agree with you more on that.
Well, I think that speaks to more broadly what my global work is all about, which is about self-leadership. To be a good leader, you have to master your own self-leadership first. And self-leadership is about not just having your own insight and awareness and understanding your blind spots and your unconscious bias, but being prepared to make a difference, being prepared to impact change in ways that you can. And if we all commit to that, can we just imagine, you know, the improvements and the positive change that can come from that? And we're seeing it. We're seeing it all over the world, where ordinary folk like you and I are starting movements and are mobilizing communities to impact huge change. And I think that's an incredible era that we're in now, where through social media, through the fact that we are so much more connected, we actually can come together and impact change, each and every one of us. You don't need a fancy title or a big pay packet to be a leader or an influencer now.
We could sit here and talk for hours. I think I've been enthralled by this chat, but unfortunately, we probably have to let it go at some point. Maybe we can have a chat over a coffee, given that we are here in Perth together at some point in the future.
Yeah.
I love the fact that your mantra, you get that real sense from your great hero. There be the change you wish to see in the world. You can see that playing out on a daily basis for you in terms of how you live your life and how you do want that significant change. And I loved hearing about your resilience and how that played through to your choices that you've made in life. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on for a chat. Rabia, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Pav. Been a pleasure for me too.